Hi everybody, Creative Katie Karen Burchill here. Welcome to my channel. Today, an art journal tutorial. This one is a twofer. It's part of the Napkin Journal series and part of the Break the Blank Page, What Comes Next. And we are keeping it simple. One napkin, one stencil, one stamp, and 3 colors. So I'm starting with this Gnome's napkin from ninniesnapkins.com. She also carries many of the TCW products, and you can check the description box for any links along those lines. First thing you need to do with the napkins is remove the excess 2 plies. They're coming off together, but it is sticking, so you need to be careful so that you don't rip the napkins. Now I'm going to water cut each of these out, and I'm just doing kind of a rough cut. I'm taking water on a liner brush and just getting rid of what I know I don't want. And right now I'm not even sure. I'm not sure if I'm going to use the houses. I'm not sure if I'm going to use all the gnomes or what I'm going to do. But I know I need to edit out the stuff that I'm not using. That can be saved and used later. Decide, okay, I don't want these little flowers here. That's not going to work from what I'm coming. And then I just keep going in and editing more and more out, getting closer to the edge and getting any of that excess napkin off. I prefer to get most of the napkin off. It does go fairly translucent. I just prefer having it a little cleaner, a little less texture where I don't want the texture to go. Because even with the napkin going translucent, there is always going to be that little extra texture. So right here, I'm just getting rid of the excess, being more precise. And it's a good habit to do. Start big and then work your way in. Once these are cut off, I can take them on the page and get a better idea about how I can make them work. So there we have, I'm testing it on, this is from my recipe binder, and this is one of the pages that I broke in the Break the Blank Page series. I started that page, I had stamped with thick gesso. Now I decided that 4 being an even number didn't look great to me, so I'm just editing. I'm cutting off some of the houses. And that allows me to put 2 over here and 2 over there, and I just play with possible compositions until I hit upon something that I like, that looks balanced, that it works. Part of this process is also, for me, deciding on the sentiment. So I grabbed my Oh Gnome You Didn't sentiment pack. That's what you saw there, and that's available now at Ninnie's Napkins. And I'm looking at the sentiments and I'm going to cut them apart. I'm going to choose a couple and continue playing with the composition. Which quote kind of goes with what I've got going here? And I picked Don't Wander Far from Gnome and Don't You Gnome Me. And I'm just trying to decide, where do I want to put the sentiment? How is it going to fit? And then making changes to the focal image if I need to, because it all works hand in hand. I don't always have it all planned out ahead of time. This one seemed to work. That way, where I was figuring out the composition before I started doing the background and adding any colors to it. So I have all these excess and they're just going in my stash and I will be able to use them. So I like having the 2 over here, the 1 there. So I'm ready to add some color to the background. And I thought, okay, we've got the houses there. So I'm going to pretend that there's sky and grass. So I am using the block and blend technique here, using light blue permanent, yellow green, and my gesso, and I'm just mixing it on the page. But instead of blocking it so much, I'm kind of going for an ombre look where it's green and then a mixture and then more blue at the top. And I love how soft this looks. And yes, I'm using one makeup sponge to apply both colors of paint. If it gets too blendy, you can stop, let it dry, and come back in. So now that I've got the background color, I'm doing a little more work and trying to decide which sentiment. I decide I want to get rid of some of that white. It's too much white. So again, just like you saw me doing with the focal image, I start big and then as I decide what I want, I cut off the excess. There I decided I don't want this guy to have a house. And I'm playing with this. Didn't like how it said me and then the letters ME right above it. So I'm still uncertain about the sentiment, but both will work in here. Which one would you like to use? And you remember that I cut out the gnome with the yellow hat. I had actually cut that off because at one time I wasn't going to use him, and now I'm putting him back on, and you'll see that's no problem at all. I took a Stabilo all pencil in white and I traced around my napkin focal images. And I'm painting this out with an angle brush and white gesso. The reason I'm doing this is the napkin is very pale. And I don't want that yellow or the green and the blue to show through and discolor my focal images. Even though I'm thinking at this point I may be painting them out, and I do. That's also why I didn't do any stenciling at this before I glued them down or any stamping because I didn't want that coming through the napkin. And you have to consider that when you're putting napkins on or things that are on tissue paper or rice paper because there's that translucency or transparency. What's behind it, you will see it. So you have to consider that. If I was using something that was printed on copy paper, I wouldn't have to worry. I could just glue it on top and that would be fine. So now that I did all the gesso behind, I'm just gluing this down with liquid matte medium, and I put quite a bit underneath and then on top, and I'm using a flat brush, but it's a clean brush and it's soft because I remember the napkins get very fragile when they're wet. Now, some of the gesso I went out of bounds. So I didn't necessarily get it glued in the exact place. So now I'm taking the green and the blue and the gesso and just with a small angle brush, just painting those areas out. So you don't see where the napkin ends and the background begins. You don't get that line. And I'm just using the makeup sponge here again a little bit just because I like the way it blends and it gives a softer feel than the brush. This is the Garden Gate stencil, and I chose to use the blue because there's that dark blue on a couple of the gnomes. Actually, 3 of the gnomes have that blue. So I wanted it to all go cohesive. And I chose this stencil because it goes with the shape of what I stamped the thick gesso with. And you can't really see that, but there's definite texture there from that very first step when I broke the page. Just edging the page in blue. And now I'm coming back with white acrylic paint and my script stencil or stamp, and I'm just stamping it in white. And it gets a little blobby, so I erase it with my baby wipe. And you can do that because everything underneath it is acrylic, and I've allowed it to dry in between layers. Here's another blob. Sometimes it doesn't bother me. Some days I'm a little more picky. So now I want the gnomes to stand out. They are the focal image. So I grab yellow, red, and blue, and I'm grabbing my angle brush, small angle brush, and I'm painting their hats, their clothing, and I'll be painting their beards too. On the napkin with the very light background, they stood out okay, but because my background is a little darker, I needed them to be darker so they would stand out. Here I have the blue paint on with a liner brush, and I'm just adding that detail, making it a little bit brighter. If you're going to paint with napkins and they're smaller scale, you need the right brushes. A good liner brush, the angle brushes, 3 or 4 different shapes. That will make your life so much easier if that's something that you're doing. I'm just painting this in. You can totally change the colors as well if you wish, but I like the primary color, that pop of brightness there. So there I'm painting in all the red. And I'm mixing the red paint with a little bit of yellow because it did have a bit of an orange tone. You can't tell from this angle, but it did. And with gesso. That gives that painterly kind of effect. And now I'm painting in the yellow hat, the yellow details. I choose not to paint the house or there's a bunny there and there's a pig. I didn't think they needed to be up front. Now I'm painting the beards and I'm adding, I guess, more hair, making them look fuzzy. I'm giving them a little bit of gray and I'm just going over that with the liner brush. And I've thinned the paint down somewhat. And then I'm going to come back with the same liner brush and thinned white paint. And I'm just going to give these guys nice hairy fuzzy beards. So we're using the napkin as the starting point. We change the composition, we're tweaking the colors, we're painting some other details in. Just kind of making it our own, using it as the base. You can see there that I'm not staying inside where the artist had their beard. I'm taking artistic license, I guess. Now I'm doing a little bit of shading on the nose with red paint just to make it stand out again. And adding some highlights. I thought I could get away with just putting highlights, which is why I did the highlights before the shading, because typically I do make it darker first. but I do come in and do shading because it just needed a little bit more definition. And I just wanted to pop. And you can look back at, if you want to know where the highlights and the shading goes, you can look back at the original one because you still have those to look at as a reference guide. So I start with the blue, and then I do end up shading with black. And to do the shading, I am using the floating acrylic technique. And this uses acrylic paint, which is permanent. And hopefully you can see how these gnomes are now pushed forward. They stand out more than they did before. I'm shading around the edge or edging the page. So once again, just a reminder, any links to products used are in the description box below. There are discount codes also listed there if you want to check that out at either TCW or at Ninny's Napkins. So I've made the final decision. Don't you know me? I thought this guy was there. He came to the house. Don't you know me anymore? So the other one will just go back in my stash. I have my Sakura glaze black, and I'm just dotting the eyes to make it give some life to these gnomes. That made such a big difference right there. That little bit of extra, and it's shiny on the page, so it's also a little extra. And then I decide that I'm going to underline these. I make a mistake, I get somewhere else, but because there's gel medium on top and the Sakura glaze, there's a little bit of working time. You can go in and wipe it off with a baby wipe, then let it dry and come back in. I just did top and bottom, didn't do all four sides this time. So here's the recap. This was broken by stamping with this DIY mark maker sink liner. Then I applied color using the block and blend technique. I used napkins for the focal image. I did some stenciling and stamping. Then I painted with gesso and the acrylic paint to bring out the focal image. I added the sentiment, outlined it. I shaded and highlighted and edged the page. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you next time. Until then, go get creative.